Hi, my name is Nathan Allen, and this is my presentation for my portion of Chapter 12, Do Martians See Red, in Dr. Ramachandran's book titled Atoms in the Brain. So in this chapter, qualia, as Dr. Ramachandran states in his book, which is the raw feel of sensations, has three necessary components in determining whether a system is conscious or not. The first is an irrevocable impetus. The second is a short-term memory retention, and the third is flexible output. In addition to these criteria, Dr. Ramachandran discusses the self as one additional necessary attribute of consciousness because it's the self, it's the you or the I, in my case, that must experience the qualia. The self is kind of a difficult concept to even ponder about and even more difficult to define. But he has characterized it and defined it as such. There's first the embodied self, then the passionate self, the executive self, the mnemonic self, the unified self, the vigilant self, and the conceptual and social self. So the embodied self is the self that's anchored or attached in a single body, and it's the body occupying space. For example, even when I'm not moving, I generally know where my hands are, where my legs are, and how my head and my body's oriented. Additionally, it may be the body that generates sensations, but it's the self that takes that sensation and feels it. The passionate self is essentially your emotional self. It's that significance is placed upon an event. As he quotes in his book, if you don't see the meaning or significance of something, in what sense are you really aware of it consciously? The executive self, is a self portion that has the representation of the world and everything contained within it, including one's own body in that representation and how one's own body interacts with that world. Due to these representations and their meanings, it's the self characteristic that kind of understands its own limitations and is responsible for decision making by use of free will, but being mindful of its limitations in exercising that free will, if that makes sense. The mnemonic self is the aspect of self that's accumulated through experience and learning, so one's sense of personal identity. It's an autobiographical aspect of self. The you know is you because of your experience in time and space. The unified self is exactly that, the attribute of self that's a cohesive unification of its traits. It's better summed up by his words. It's this process which connects your perceptual qualia with specific emotions and goals, enabling you to make choices, and in this way, it's kind of associated with the executive self as well. There's the vigilant self, which is also exactly what it sounds like. It's kind of the alertness of the self. Ramachandran references akinetic mutism to aid in describing this by contrast instead of by comparison. And those with this mutism are immobile, mute, and slow to respond, but they track objects with their eyes, and when they come out of the state, they're known to have said, no words or thoughts would come to my mind, I just didn't want to do or think or say anything. The conceptual and social self, finally, is the self-manufactured as it pertains to others. Usually the self's thought of as a private construct, but the social self is, it's actually one of the more reliable of his multifaceted descriptions of self, I think, because he gives a really good example. He says, for you who doubt the existence of the social self, imagine you're on your deathbed and you've committed something atrocious like adultery, and you want to cover it up from your friends and family. Despite you soon no longer existing, why would you want to do that? Which is often the case, and it's for the reputation of the social self because, there's some form of you as a permanence. So these are the characteristics of the self, and while they're interesting, something perhaps a little more tangible is Dr. Ramachandran's thought of the seat of consciousness being primarily active in the temporal lobes instead of the frontal lobes, which is common thought. He suggests this because lesions and hyperactivity here present some of the greatest alterations in consciousness that we've seen, such as in temporal lobe epileptics. When they experience a seizure, the result is a profound disturbance in consciousness, and when surgeons stimulate the temporal lobes, in these epileptics, they experience vivid hallucinations of sights and sounds and smells. One of the main reasons, though, why I think that he chooses the temporal lobes is because this is where most of language is represented. He gives the example of seeing an apple. When you see an apple, temporal lobe activity allows you to interpret, all the implications therein. What it means nutritionally to you, what the image of an apple represents. What you can do with an apple. You can bake a pie, etc. And there's no default thinking mode. It's language. It's what's learned. So that kind of led me to an interesting study that was titled Coevolution of Human Consciousness and Language, where the author Michael Abrams suggested exactly this, that consciousness has co-evolved with language, and he summarizes this in a few main points. That human consciousness, as we normally experience it, is a property of the brain rather than some separate mind stuff or mind matter. It's possible that portions of our brain can support forms of animal awareness that may enrich human consciousness but seem qualitatively different in nature. But what makes human consciousness so different is that it includes expression of our thoughts and language. And so some more support for this idea of the temporal lobe being the main seat of consciousness also comes from hallucinogenics and other drugs that alter consciousness. One of the most potent of these, if not the most potent, is DMT or dimethyltryptamine, and that's the active ingredient in ayahuasca, which is a ceremonial brew made by the tribes in the Amazon for divine and ritualistic purposes. And a recent study found that the psychedelic state induced by ayahuasca modulates the activity and connectivity of the default mode network. And the default mode network is a combination of brain regions that are active during wakeful rest, or when somebody isn't paying attention externally or to a goal-oriented task. So, for example, if you're daydreaming, your default network is likely active. And in fact, in a paper in 2008 by Buckner and colleagues titled "The Brain's Default Network," they showed that the default mode network was shown to be active during retrieving autobiographical memories, when envisioning the future, and also conceiving the perspectives of others. So this is, this coincides with some of the aspects of the self that I mentioned earlier. But the areas involved in the default mode network showed less activity after the intake of ayahuasca. So kind of the glue to all this and the default mode network is, one of the brain regions that activates in regards to the default mode network. One of the big ones is the medial temporal lobe. In addition to that, a study by, gonna butcher it, Gayolhazy and Varga, they're Hungarian, titled Correlations of Consciousness and the Default Function of the Brain. It discusses research on how awake consciousness is associated with the default network, and I'm past my time, so this is just kind of a general brief overview of the self and of consciousness. Very basic. There's a lot of information and misinformation out there, so it's kind of hard to sift through it, but hopefully it was somewhat educational.